On the 2nd of August in the year 1100, a king of England rode out into the woods to hunt, and by the time the light failed, he was lying dead on the forest floor with an arrow through his chest, abandoned by every nobleman who'd ridden out with him that afternoon. No grand funeral procession came for him. A local charcoal burner named Perkis loaded the body onto a cart, the kind used for hauling wood, and the blood is said to have dripped from it the whole way to Winchester. The man in that cart was William II, son of William the Conqueror, the second Norman king of England, and almost nobody who was there when he died wanted to talk about exactly how it happened. No inquest was held. No one was ever charged. The official version was an accident, and the official version was very convenient for the people who told it. The brother who stood to gain everything didn't stay to mourn. He was already galloping for the royal treasury. Welcome in. Good to have you here tonight, whether you've been with the channel a while or you only just stumbled across this in the dark somewhere. Do me a favor while you're settling in and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. To everyone who supports what I do here, the people who keep the whole thing running so I can sit with this material as long as it deserves. Thank you, truly. It means a great deal. Get comfortable. We've got 5 strange corners of the medieval world to wander through tonight, and not a single one of them has a tidy answer waiting at the end of it. That's rather the point. So, back to the dead king in the cart. William II is one of those medieval figures who comes down to us mostly through the words of people who couldn't stand him. The chroniclers who recorded his reign were, almost to a man, churchmen, and William and the church were locked in a long, sour quarrel for nearly the whole of his time on the throne. He squeezed the church for money, left bishoprics and abbeys deliberately empty so he could pocket their revenues, and clashed bitterly with Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who eventually gave up and went into exile rather than keep fighting him. So when those same churchmen sat down to write his history, you can imagine how generous they felt. They called him cruel, greedy, godless. They sneered at his court as a den of long hair and loose morals and fashions they found scandalous. The man never had a chance at a fair write-up, and it's worth holding that in mind because almost everything unflattering we're told about him comes from people with a reason to bury his reputation alongside the body. He was known as William Rufus, the Red. Most people take that as a reference to his complexion, a ruddy, red-faced man, florid, the kind of skin that goes blotchy in the cold or in temper. Some think it might have been his hair. The chronicler William of Malmesbury gives us about the only physical description we have: a thick-set, powerful man with a barrel chest, blonde or reddish hair parted in the middle, and eyes of different colors, flecked with light. He had a stammer, apparently, that got worse when he was angry, which by the sound of it was often. He never married. He left no children, legitimate or otherwise, which is genuinely unusual for a medieval king and has fueled centuries of speculation about him that I'm going to set to one side, because the chronicler's hostility makes it impossible to separate fact from slander, and frankly, the manner of his death is the real mystery here, not his private life. The quarrel with the church deserves a moment because it shaped how his death was remembered and possibly how it was caused. When a bishop or an abbot died, the revenues of that office reverted to the crown until a replacement was appointed. And Rufus worked out that if he simply never got around to appointing a replacement, he could pocket those revenues indefinitely. So he left the great see of Canterbury itself vacant for years after the old archbishop died, scooping up its income, treating the wealth of the English church as a private slush fund. When he was gravely ill at one point and thought he might die, he panicked, repented, and finally appointed Anselm, a brilliant, stubborn, deeply principled scholar-monk who absolutely did not want the job. The moment Rufus recovered his health, he recovered his old habits, and the two men were soon at war over the rights of the church against the crown. Anselm wanted to answer to the Pope. Rufus wanted his archbishop to answer to him. It got so bitter that Anselm left the country. To the churchman writing the history, here was a king actively robbing God, and when an arrow found his chest in a forest, they did not reach for the word tragedy. They reached for the word judgment. What everyone agrees on, even his enemies, is that he was an effective, ruthless soldier king. He held England down hard, beat back his own brother's attempt to take the throne early in the reign, pushed the borders with Wales and Scotland, and got his hands on Normandy when that same brother, Robert, pawned the entire duchy to him to fund going off on the First Crusade. Think about that arrangement for a second, because it matters enormously for what followed. Robert needed cash to go crusading. Rufus had cash. So Rufus lent his brother a vast sum and took Normandy as security, meaning that as long as Robert was away in the Holy Land, Rufus effectively ruled both England and the duchy, the whole of his father's old realm reunited under one of the three sons. And Robert was, in the summer of 1100, on his way home. Successful, celebrated, a hero of the crusade, coming back to reclaim his duchy, and quite possibly to make a play for more. The clock was ticking on the whole arrangement. Whoever wanted to control the Norman world had a narrow window before Robert got home and changed the board. The Norman world in those years was a nest of brothers circling each other, and that matters for what's coming, so let me lay it out plainly. William the Conqueror had left three sons who survived him. The eldest, Robert Curthose. The nickname means something like short stockings, a dig at his stature, got Normandy. The middle son, William Rufus, got England, the richer prize, which already tells you the conqueror trusted him more. And the youngest, Henry, got no land at all, just a pile of silver and a great deal of ambition. Three brothers, 2 crowns worth of territory between them, and one of them holding nothing but money and a grudge. Henry spent years as the odd man out, shifting alliances, waiting. He was, by every account, patient, clever, and cold. Now to the hunt itself, because this is where it stops being ordinary history and starts being a genuine puzzle that historians still chew on 900 years later. The New Forest wasn't an ancient woodland with a romantic name. William the Conqueror had created it, only a few decades earlier, as a royal hunting preserve. And he'd done it the way a conqueror does things, clearing out villages and farmland, pulling down dwellings, turning whole communities off land their families had worked for generations. so that he and his sons could chase deer across it in peace. The forest law that protected it was savage. Harm one of the king's deer, and you could be blinded or mutilated for it. So the people who lived around the edges of the new forest had real and bitter reasons to resent the Norman kings, and the forest itself, beautiful as it was, sat on top of a grievance. It was a monument to displacement, and everyone local knew it. And the forest had already acquired a grim little reputation within the conqueror's own family. Rufus's own brother, another of the conqueror's sons named Richard, had died there years earlier in some kind of hunting accident, gored or thrown or struck. The accounts disagree. And just months before Rufus's own death, one of his nephews, an illegitimate son of his eldest brother Robert, was also killed in that same forest, caught and killed by a stray arrow or a branch, depending on who tells it. So by the summer of 1100, the New Forest had already swallowed at least 2 members of this one royal family in hunting deaths. Rufus would make 3. People noticed that afterward. People always notice that sort of pattern once the 3rd one falls, and the local population, who had every reason to feel the forest was cursed ground stolen from them, noticed it most of all. A family that took people's land to hunt deer, dying one by one among those same deer. It had the shape of a story even before anyone decided what the story meant. The day started oddly. The chroniclers say Rufus had slept badly and was unsettled. There are stories of warnings, a monk who'd had an ominous dream, messengers arriving with omens, an abbot who dreamt the king was gnawing at the crucifix. Rufus, who had no patience for that kind of thing, supposedly laughed it all off with a crude joke about monks dreaming for money, ate a big meal, drank, and rode out late in the afternoon. The late start matters. It meant they'd be hunting into the low, glaring light of evening, the sun coming sideways through the trees. The worst possible conditions for telling a deer from a shadow or a man. The hunting party split up, as they did, fanning out through the trees to drive the deer, and at some point in the failing light, the king ended up more or less alone, or nearly alone, with one companion in particular, a French nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, Lord of Poix, a guest known as a fine shot. The fullest account, from William of Malmesbury writing about 25 years later, has Rufus handing Tyrrell a couple of arrows and saying something like, "Good marksman, good arrows. Share them out, the best shafts to the best archer." A stag broke from cover. Rufus loosed an arrow and only wounded it, and raised his hand to shield his eyes against the dying sun to watch where it ran. And in that same moment, Tyrrell shot at another deer, and his arrow, or an arrow anyway, struck the king full in the chest, driving deep, piercing a lung. The accounts of the next few seconds vary, and the variation is part of the mystery. Malmesbury says Rufus snapped off the protruding shaft, said not a single word, and pitched forward onto the ground, driving the stub deeper into himself and hastening his own death. He died there in the dirt without speaking. Other writers move the arrow around. One has it glancing off the back of the stag before hitting the king. Another has it ricocheting off a tree. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the closest thing to a contemporary record, says only that the king was shot with an arrow by one of his own men, and pointedly does not name Tyrrell at all. That silence has always interested me. The most contemporary source declines to point the finger at the man everyone else blames. And here's the thing that turns a hunting accident into a question that won't die. Look at what everyone did next. Walter Tyrrell did not raise the alarm. He did not cradle the dying king, or ride for help or stand by the body. He got on his horse and fled, straight for the coast, across the channel, out of the kingdom, and he never came back to England as long as he lived. There's a colourful legend that he stopped at a blacksmith and had his horse's shoes reversed so his pursuers would track him the wrong way, which is almost certainly invented, but the flight itself is real, and nobody came after him. That's the strange part. No hue and cry, no pursuit, no charge, no punishment. His lands in England were not seized. His wife went on holding her estates for decades afterward, untouched. A foreign nobleman had just put an arrow through the King of England, and the Norman state simply let him ride away and got on with other business. The body got the same treatment. The great men of the hunt, the barons, the king's own household, scattered. They left him lying there. They rode off to secure their own positions and their own property because a king was dead, and the only thing that mattered now was who'd be king next. The corpse of the man who'd ruled England for 13 years was left on the forest floor for commoners to deal with, which is how a charcoal burner ended up carting the King of England to Winchester on a wagon meant for firewood, the blood leaking out between the boards the whole way. And the brother, Henry, the landless youngest son, had been part of that hunting party. He was somewhere in those same woods that afternoon. The instant he learned Rufus was dead, he did not waste a single hour grieving. He rode hard for Winchester, where the royal treasury sat, and seized it. Physically took control of the silver and the regalia, because in a disputed succession whoever holds the treasury holds the high cards. There was reportedly a tense confrontation at the treasury door, a rival noble trying to block him, swords nearly drawn over the dead king's gold. Henry won. Then he rode for London, and within 3 days, of his brother lying dead in the dirt, Henry had himself crowned King of England. The speed of it is breathtaking. He had a coronation charter ready, a document promising to right his brother's abuses, drawn up and waiting. He knew exactly what to do and did it before the body was cold, before his eldest brother Robert, the man with arguably the better claim, could even get home from the crusade to object. By the time Robert finally landed back in Normandy, his younger brother was already an anointed king with the treasury in hand, and there was very little Robert could do about it. Henry later finished the job, defeated Robert in battle, took Normandy off him, and locked his eldest brother up in comfortable captivity for the last 28 years of Robert's life. 3 brothers, and the youngest, the one who started with nothing but silver, ended with everything, so you can see the shape of the suspicion. A king nobody at the top much loved, dead by an arrow in a convenient accident, in a forest, in bad light, at the precise narrow moment when seizing power was still possible before the eldest brother got home. The man who fired the shot flees and is never pursued, never punished, his property left intact, which is not how you treat a man who killed your king by accident, and not how you treat a murderer either, unless someone powerful wanted him gone and unbothered. and the one person who gained everything just happened to be on the scene and moved with such flawless, instant precision afterward that it looks less like a man reacting to a shock and more like a man executing a plan he'd already worked out in his head. Now, I want to be fair to the accident, because the honest historians are divided and the accident is genuinely plausible. Hunting deaths were common enough that nobody at the time treated a death by arrow in a forest as automatically sinister. Shooting into low evening sun in dense forest, with a party spread out and everyone loosing arrows at moving animals, is exactly the situation where a stray shot kills someone. The bow of that era was a powerful thing, and an arrow loosed at a deer could easily carry on through brush and find a man it was never aimed at. Walter Tyrrell may have fled simply because he understood correctly that being the foreigner who'd just killed the King of England was a death sentence regardless of intent, accident or not. That no amount of explaining would save a Frenchman standing over a dead Norman king. Panic explains the flight just as well as conspiracy does, and the lack of pursuit might just mean that everyone with power had already moved on to the only question that mattered, which was the succession, and nobody had any appetite for avenging a king they were glad to be rid of. And there's a fascinating wrinkle. Years later, in exile in France, Tyrrell swore to a man who had no reason to lie for him, the abbot Suger, who knew him personally and sheltered him, that he hadn't even been in that part of the forest, that he never saw the king in the woods at all, that he didn't fire the arrow. Not, it was an accident. A flat denial of the whole thing, which only deepens it, doesn't it? If it was a genuine accident, the natural thing would be to say so, especially since half of England regarded Rufus's death as God's own justice on a wicked king. Admitting to the unlucky shot would have made Tyrrell almost an instrument of providence, not a criminal. Instead, he denied being anywhere near it. So either he was lying to clear his name of even an accidental death, or he was telling the truth, and the arrow that killed William Rufus was fired by someone else entirely, someone the chroniclers never named, in a forest full of armed men, one of whom had a great deal to gain. We are never going to know. There's no confession, no smoking arrow, no document that settles it, and at this distance there never will be. What we have is a dead king, a vanished archer nobody bothered to chase, a scattering of frightened noblemen who left their sovereign's body in the dirt, and a brother who turned an afternoon's hunting disaster into a crown inside 72 hours. You can line those facts up one way and see a tragic accident compounded by panic and opportunism, men reacting fast to a sudden death, grabbing what they could in the chaos, which is human and ugly but not murder. Or you can line the very same facts up another way and see a quiet, professional killing, arranged by the one man positioned to profit, carried out by a guest who then conveniently disappeared with no one lifting a finger to stop him. The maddening thing is that the evidence genuinely supports both readings, and the people who could have told us the difference all had powerful reasons to keep their mouths shut, and did. Henry I went on to rule England for 35 years, and ruled it well by most measures. Orderly, lawful, effective, remembered as one of the more capable medieval kings. He never seems to have been troubled by questions about how he came by the throne. The winners rarely are, and the new forest kept its reputation as a place where the conqueror's sons rode in and didn't always ride out. There's a stone in that forest now, the Rufus stone, marking roughly where he's supposed to have fallen. It's been moved and replaced over the centuries, and nobody's certain it's even the right spot. A monument to an event nobody fully understands, standing in approximately the wrong place. That feels about right for William Rufus. It's worth saying how the ordinary people of England took the news, because it tells you how little the man was mourned. The chroniclers record no great national grief. Instead, they record omens and grim satisfaction. Talk of blood seen bubbling from the ground, of the king's wickedness catching up with him, of God's hand in the arrow. He was buried at Winchester Cathedral quickly and without much ceremony, no elaborate rites, and when the cathedral's central tower collapsed a few years later, some were quick to mutter that it had fallen because so ungodly a man lay beneath it. That's the reputation he left, a king whose own subjects half believed the building above his grave had recoiled from him. Whether any of that is fair to the actual man is another question entirely. Remember who was holding the pens. But it's the verdict that stuck, and it's part of why his death has always been so easy to read as a killing. When nobody mourns a king, and his death hands the throne to a brother who'd been left with nothing, people are going to wonder. They wondered then in their own way, and they've never quite stopped. Let's leave the king and his firewood cart and move to something stranger still, a mystery that isn't about who killed one man in a wood, but about what came over hundreds of ordinary people all at once, in the streets of a real and prosperous city, in the heat of one terrible summer. With Rufus, the puzzle is a single death and a single missing answer. Who loosed the arrow, and why no one would say? What's coming is the opposite kind of puzzle. Not one death in a quiet forest, but a slow public catastrophe unfolding in the open over weeks, watched by an entire town, recorded by its officials, and still, even with all those witnesses, all that ink, completely unexplained. Because in the year 1518 in Strasbourg, people started dancing and they could not stop. It began with one woman. Her name comes down to us as Frau Trophea, and one day in July of 1518 she walked out into a narrow street in Strasbourg, then a free city of the Holy Roman Empire, a prosperous place of guilds and merchants and a great half-built cathedral, now part of France. And she began to dance, not at a celebration, not to any music. There was no festival, no wedding, no Saints' Day procession, no reason anyone could see. She simply started moving, alone, in the open street, her body twisting and jerking and turning, and she kept it up, through the afternoon, into the evening. The accounts suggest her husband was anything but pleased. This was not a respectable thing for a married woman to be doing in public, drawing a crowd, and she would not stop for his shouting, would not stop for his pleading, would not stop for anyone. She danced until she dropped from sheer exhaustion, slept where she fell or was carried off, and when she woke, she got up and danced again, and again. By some accounts, she kept this going for 4 to 6 days, her shoes worn through, her feet bloodied, moving like a woman possessed by a will that wasn't her own. What must it have looked like to the neighbors leaning out of their windows? A woman they knew, going about a thing none of them had a word for, hour after hour, with no music to dance to and no joy in her face. You can understand why a crowd gathered. And then the truly frightening thing happened, the thing that turns one woman's strange affliction into one of history's great unexplained events. Other people started doing it too. Within about a week, more than 30 people had joined her. Within a month, the chronicles claim the number had climbed to something like 400. 400 people in the streets and squares of one city, dancing, not joyfully, not in any organized or festive way, but compulsively, helplessly, many of them visibly not wanting to and entirely unable to stop. This is not a folk tale dressed up as history. The dancing plague of 1518 is one of the best documented strange events of the entire late medieval and early modern period. We have it from the municipal records of Strasbourg itself, from the notes of physicians who were called in, from the accounts of contemporaries and near-contemporaries who watched it or heard of it firsthand and wrote it down. The city council met about it, and its deliberations were recorded. Money was raised and spent. Official decisions were made and entered into the books. This happened in front of named officials in a real and important city on datable days in a known year, and that is exactly what makes it so unsettling. It isn't a legend you can quietly wave away as medieval exaggeration. The paperwork survives in the dry, practical language of a city government trying to manage a crisis it did not understand. And it was not harmless. This is the part that gets lost when people picture a quaint medieval dancing fad, something colorful and faintly comic. These people danced themselves into the ground in the most literal way. Contemporary sources describe dancers collapsing from exhaustion, from dehydration, from heat stroke in the brutal heat of a continental summer, suffering strokes and heart attacks brought on by days of ceaseless, frantic physical exertion in heavy clothing under a July and August sun. Their feet gave out first, blistered, then bleeding, then ruined, and still they moved. One account claims that at the height of it, around 15 people were dying every single day. Now, that figure may well be inflated. Medieval and early modern numbers usually are, and a careful person treats a round, dramatic toll like that with caution. But even the most conservative reading of the sources is grim. People genuinely died of this. They danced until their hearts failed or their bodies simply quit. And the horror of it, the thing the watching crowds could see plainly, was that the dying ones did not seem able to stop themselves in time to live. Their own bodies had been taken out of their hands. Imagine watching a neighbor dance toward their own death over the course of days and being powerless to talk them out of it, because there was no one in there to talk to, just the dancing. The response of the Strasbourg authorities is, to me, the most fascinating and the most baffling part of the whole episode, because of what it tells you about how completely it confused everyone at the time. They brought in physicians, and the physicians ruled out the supernatural. They did not, by the surviving accounts, conclude this was demonic possession or witchcraft, which is what you might expect from the period. Instead, they landed on a medical explanation in the language of their day. This was caused by hot blood, an overheating of the body, a natural ailment of the blood and the brain. And from that diagnosis came the single strangest decision of the entire affair. If the dancing was a fever in the blood that needed to burn itself out, then the cure was to let the afflicted dance it off completely until the fever broke. So the city helped them dance. The authorities cleared spaces for it. They are said to have opened up 2 guild halls and a section of the grain market for the dancers to use, and by some accounts had a wooden stage put up in the horse market so the afflicted would have room to move. And this is the detail that sounds invented but is recorded in the sources. They hired musicians, pipers and drummers to play for the dancers, and even brought in strong, healthy men to take the sufferers by the arms and keep them on their feet, to dance alongside them and move them along, on the firm medical theory that the sooner the affliction was exhausted, the sooner the afflicted would be free of it. Sit with the scene the city deliberately created in response to people collapsing and dying from compulsive dancing. More dancing with a live band, on a public stage, with hired partners to keep the exhausted ones moving when their own legs gave out. It is, with 500 years of hindsight, a near-perfect example of a cure making a disease worse. They poured fuel directly onto the fire. The music and the stage and the spectacle almost certainly pulled more frightened, suggestible people into the dancing and pushed the ones already dancing past the limits of their bodies. At some point, the council clearly grasped that the strategy was a disaster, because the policy reversed hard and fast. The music was stopped. The public dancing was forbidden, allowed only in private homes away from the crowds. Gambling and prostitution and other public gatherings were curtailed, the city trying to drain the fevered, festival-like atmosphere out of its own streets. And then came the final move, the turn from the physician's medicine back to the older medicine of the saints. The afflicted were gathered up and carried out of the city to a shrine in the hills, to be placed in the care of Saint Vitus himself. That shrine is a thread worth pulling, because Saint Vitus is woven all the way through this. Vitus was an early Christian martyr, a boy saint said to have been put to death under the Romans, and somewhere along the centuries he became, in the popular mind of this part of Europe, the saint bound up with dancing, both invoked for protection against compulsive dancing and, in a darker turn of the belief, thought capable of inflicting it on those who crossed him. There was a real folk dread across the Rhineland and Alsace that if you angered Saint Vitus, or even just danced before his image on his feast day in the wrong spirit, he might lay this very curse on you. A helpless, unstoppable, sometimes deadly compulsion to dance. The condition we still call Saint Vitus's dance, a name later attached to certain disorders that cause involuntary jerking movements of the body, comes straight out of this cluster of beliefs, this old conviction that the saint could seize your limbs and make them move whether you willed it or not. So the people of Strasbourg already had a ready-made framework for what they were seeing. This wasn't a baffling new disease to them in the way it is to us. To them it had a name and a cause and a culprit. St. Vitus was angry, and he was making people dance. Which is why the final remedy made a grim kind of sense by the logic of the time. When Strasbourg gathered up its afflicted and hauled them by wagon up into the hills to a chapel dedicated to Saint Vitus, they were going to the source, appeasing the very saint they believed had sent the affliction in the first place, begging him to lift what he had laid down. There were rituals at the shrine, red shoes for the dancers in some tellings, prayers and offerings and small wooden figures, masses said over them. They were treating the supernatural cause with a supernatural cure, going over the head of the baffled physicians straight to the saint himself. And whether it was the saint's mercy, or the cooler weather as summer faded, or simply the fact that the human body and the collective panic could not sustain it forever, the dancing did, in time, ease and then stop. The city went back to its ordinary troubles, of which it had plenty. But it remembered, it wrote it down. That's why we're still talking about it. Here's what genuinely surprises most people. 1518 was not the only time this happened. It was the largest and best documented outbreak, but it sits in a whole tradition of dancing manias that flared up across medieval and early modern Europe, mostly along the Rhine and in the Low Countries for centuries. There was a famous and very large outbreak in 1374 that swept through towns along the Rhine, Aachen, Cologne, Liège, and others, spreading down the river and into the Low Countries, where people danced through the streets in great writhing groups, foaming at the mouth, screaming, claiming to see visions of heaven or of demons, some of them clearly tormented and crying out for it to end, calling on bystanders to help them or to bind them. Contemporaries described the dancers as gripped by something that looked like collective madness, leaping and twisting until they collapsed. In some towns, the authorities turned to priests and exorcism. In others, the dancers were simply endured until the fit passed. There are scattered reports going back earlier still. Tales of dancers in the 11 and 1200s, even a much-repeated legend of a group who danced in a churchyard one Christmas, disturbing the priest at his mass, and were said to have been cursed to keep dancing without rest for a full year, unable to stop, sinking up to their knees in the ground. That last one is plainly folklore. But folklore grows around something, and the something here was a real and recurring terror that people had watched with their own eyes. The 1518 event in Strasbourg is the one with the best paper trail, but it was part of this larger European phenomenon, a thing that came and went across generations, always along roughly the same stretch of Europe, always with the same eerie core. Ordinary people, dancing against their will, sometimes to death. And it's worth sitting with how specific that is. This wasn't a thing that happened everywhere. It clustered, the same region, the same river valley, the same cultural world, returning to the same affliction across 2 or 3 centuries. Whatever caused it was somehow tied to that particular place and the things the people of that place believed and feared. So what on earth was actually happening? And the honest answer, the one I'd rather give you straight than dress up, is that nobody knows for certain. There is no settled, proven explanation, but there are several serious theories, and they're worth walking through, because each one tells you something and none of them quite closes the case. The first, and for a long time the most popular, is poisoning, specifically ergot, a toxic fungus, ergot of rye, that grows on damp grain in wet seasons and gets ground into the flour and baked into the bread of whole communities. Ergot is genuinely dangerous stuff. It contains compounds chemically related to LSD, and ergot poisoning, called ergotism, can cause violent convulsions, twitching and spasming of the limbs, vivid hallucinations, and a horrible burning sensation in the hands and feet. In fact, one of its old names was St. Anthony's Fire. On the surface, it seems to fit beautifully. Contaminated grain after a wet harvest, a whole town eating the same bad bread, and then mass strange behavior and visions. It's tidy. The trouble is that it really doesn't hold up once you press on it. The severe convulsive form of ergotism also constricts the blood vessels and cuts off circulation to the extremities, which is what produces that burning and, in bad cases, gangrene, fingers and toes and whole limbs going black and dying. It leaves people desperately, systemically ill, often delirious, frequently dying in agony. It does not leave people able to perform sustained, coordinated, days-long dancing. And dancing is precisely what these people did. Not thrashing on the ground, but up on their feet, moving for days. Poisoned bodies in the grip of severe ergotism could not do that. Most historians who've examined it closely have set the ergot theory down for exactly that reason. It's the explanation everyone reaches for first, and one of the first that careful people abandon. The second theory points at the mind rather than the bread. What gets called mass psychogenic illness, or in older language, mass hysteria. The idea is that under enormous stress, real physical symptoms can spread through a population by suggestion, with no toxin and no infection involved, purely through the nervous system responding to fear and to the example of others. And the context here is crucial because 1518 Strasbourg was a city under tremendous strain. The years leading up to it had been brutal, repeated failed harvests, soaring grain prices, famine and waves of disease including smallpox, and what people called the sweating sickness, and the ever-present dread of the plague. The poor were desperate, hungry, frightened and exhausted. The historian John Waller, who's written the most about this, argues that this combination of extreme stress and a deeply held regional belief in the curse of St. Vitus created the perfect conditions for a kind of mass involuntary trance. That people already at the breaking point, who genuinely believed St. Vitus could strike them with compulsive dancing, fell into exactly that state under the weight of their own fear and conviction. A self-fulfilling terror spreading from body to body through a population primed to expect it. There's something to that. It accounts for why this clustered in a particular region with a particular saint, why it hit in a year of particular misery, and why it spread by watching. You see your neighbor seized by the very curse you've dreaded your whole life, and your own terrified, exhausted, malnourished mind does the rest. Waller also points out that there's good evidence people in this region and period were unusually prone to entering trance states, that the religious culture was saturated with the expectation of divine and saintly intervention in the body, with visions and possessions and miraculous afflictions. So the ground was already prepared for the mind to seize control of the body in dramatic, involuntary ways. A population that fully expects that a saint can take over your limbs is a population in which, under enough pressure, a saint sometimes does, or something the sufferer cannot tell apart from it. It's the explanation most serious historians lean toward today, and I think it's the strongest one on the table. But I'll be honest about its limits, the way I'd want someone to be honest with me. Calling something mass psychogenic illness is in some ways just giving the mystery a name rather than solving it. We don't actually understand the mechanism by which sheer dread makes hundreds of people dance for days until some of them die. We can describe it. We can point at the stress and the belief and the social contagion and the trance-prone culture. But the leap from a frightened, starving population to 400 people physically unable to stop moving their bodies, dancing through blistered feet and past the point of collapse, some of them dying of it. That leap is still, when you sit with it, deeply strange. There are modern cases that rhyme with it, outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness in schools and factories where symptoms spread through a group with no physical cause anyone can find, so we know the basic phenomenon is real. But none of those modern cases involves people dancing themselves to death for weeks. The scale and the lethality of 1518 sit at the very edge of what the theory can comfortably hold. Other ideas have been floated over the years and mostly set aside. That it was some heretical religious cult or sect dancing deliberately as a ritual. But that doesn't fit the accounts of people plainly suffering, weeping, begging for it to end, and dying against their will. Cult members don't usually need to be propped up by hired strangers or carried off to a shrine. That it was a single specific neurological disease, epilepsy or something like it, spread somehow through the population. But no known disease behaves quite like this, jumping from person to person by sight and striking hundreds at once. That it was outright invention or wild exaggeration by the chroniclers, except the city's own administrative records back the core of it up, and bureaucrats keeping accounts don't tend to fabricate crises that cost them money to manage. None of the rival explanations has won the field. What we're left with is the documented, undeniable fact of the thing, sitting there in Strasbourg's own civic memory, and a row of theories that each catch a piece of it, and not one of which catches the whole. And that, more than the spectacle of the dancing itself, is what stays with me about Strasbourg. We tend to assume that the further back in time you go, the more the strangeness is just legend and exaggeration. That if we only had better records, the mystery would melt away into some ordinary explanation. But here the records are good. We know it happened. We know roughly how many and where and when and what the baffled authorities tried to do about it, step by step, because they wrote it down in their own hand as it unfolded. And we still cannot say with real confidence what made Frau Trophea step out into that July street and begin to dance, or what reached out over the following weeks and pulled 400 of her neighbours in after her, some of them never to walk home again. The better the documentation gets, the sharper the mystery becomes, because you can no longer comfort yourself that it was only ever a story somebody made up. From a whole city that couldn't stop moving, let's turn to a single object that's kept perfectly still for 800 years and frightened people the entire time. The dancing left almost nothing behind you can touch. A few lines in a ledger, a worn-out path up to a shrine, the memory of a summer. This next mystery is the opposite. It's a thing you could, in theory, walk up to and put your hands on, sitting under glass in a library to this day. A book so enormous it takes 2 grown adults to lift it, written out by one anonymous hand over what may have been 30 years. with the devil's own portrait staring out of the middle of it. People have been afraid of it for centuries, and unlike a forest or a dance, it's still right here, waiting to be opened. In the treasure room of the National Library of Sweden in Stockholm, there's a manuscript so large it takes 2 people to lift it off the shelf. It's called the Codex Gigas, the giant book, and the numbers attached to it are almost hard to make yourself believe. It stands about 92 centimeters tall, which is roughly 3 feet, taller than a lot of toddlers. It's around ½ a meter wide, and it weighs close to 75 kilograms, about 165 pounds. The weight of a grown man bound up in wooden boards and leather. To make a thing that size, somebody had to slaughter and prepare the skins of something on the order of 160 animals, calves most likely, scraping and stretching and treating each hide into a single sheet of pale vellum. If you took all 310 of its surviving leaves and laid them flat on the floor side by side, they'd cover an area bigger than some apartments people pay rent for. It is, as far as anyone knows, the largest surviving manuscript from the entire medieval world. There is simply nothing else like it for sheer physical mass, but people don't know it by its proper name. They know it as the Devil's Bible. And it earned that name honestly, because about 2/3 of the way through the book, on a single full page, there is a portrait of the devil himself. He's enormous, ½ a meter tall, taking up the whole sheet, crouched and facing straight out at you with his arms raised over his head, as though he's gathering himself to spring up off the page at whoever opened the book. Green face, red horns curling up from his head, 2 long forked tongues, the doubled tongue of the serpent, of the liar, of the deceiver in the Garden of Eden, claws on his hands and on his feet, and a fierce, fixed stare. He's drawn at the proportions of a man, not some monstrous giant, which somehow makes him worse. He looks like a person who has gone deeply, fundamentally wrong. And he's naked except for one strange and very deliberate detail. A little loincloth marked with the pattern of ermine fur, the white and black tails that medieval Europe used to mark out royalty and the very highest nobility. So this isn't simply a devil, one demon among many. This is the devil dressed in the heraldry of a king. The Prince of Darkness, wearing the furs of a sovereign, sitting for a formal portrait. And there is almost nothing else like it in all of medieval manuscript art. Devils turn up constantly in medieval imagery, little tormentors scurrying in the margins, demons in crowded scenes of the Last Judgment, the occasional dragon. But a full-page, solo, formal portrait of Satan, posed and crowned and taking up an entire vast sheet of vellum all to himself, is very nearly unique in the whole surviving record. He sat for his portrait, and somebody painted him, and he isn't even alone on his side of the book, which is the part that gets left out of the spooky retellings. Open the codex to that spread, and the page directly facing the devil shows the heavenly city, the kingdom of heaven, walls and towers and gates, beautifully done and completely empty of people, not a single soul in it. So whoever planned this enormous book set it up deliberately so that every time a reader reaches that point, they're caught between the two. Heaven on the left-hand page, hell crouching on the right, the two of them staring at each other across the gutter of the binding, and the reader stuck right there in the gap, forced to choose a side just by looking. The pages clustered around that spread are noticeably darker than the rest of the book, written in pale yellow letters on parchment that's turned brown. And the reason for that turns out to be almost mournfully human once you hear it. The discoloration comes from centuries of people opening the book to this exact page over and over to look at the devil, exposing those particular leaves to light and air far more than the rest of the volume, which mostly stayed shut in the dark. The book is literally worn down and stained at the precise point of its most famous and most frightening image, because across 800 years, almost nobody who got their hands on it could resist turning to look at him. The wear pattern is a record of human curiosity. We did that, one reader at a time. The legend behind the whole thing is as good as the object, and it's old. It was already being told in the Middle Ages, not invented later. As the story goes, there was a monk at a small monastery in Bohemia, and tradition gives him the name Herman the Recluse. This monk broke his vows in some serious way. Serious enough that the punishment handed down was the worst thing a monastery could do to one of its own short of execution. He was to be walled up alive, immured, sealed into a small space with no way out, and left there to die in the dark. Desperate, with the wall about to go up, he made his abbot a wild offer. "Spare me," he said, "and in a single night, one night, I will write you a book that will glorify this monastery forever, a single volume that will contain all of human knowledge." The abbot, who presumably figured this was flatly impossible, and that the man would die in the attempt and save everyone the trouble, agreed, and the monk set to work as the hours bled away. And somewhere around midnight he understood, with the wall waiting for him, that he could never finish, that no human hand could. So he prayed, but not to God. He turned and prayed instead to Lucifer, offering up his own soul in exchange for help finishing the book before the sun came up. And the devil, in the legend, took the deal and completed the work for him. And the monk, grateful and damned in the same breath, painted that full-page portrait of his benefactor into the pages as a kind of thank you, a signature almost, a receipt for a soul. It's a marvelous story, and almost none of it is true, but the real story has a strange weight of its own that I think is actually better. The book was made in the early 13th century, somewhere between roughly 1204 and 1230, at a small Benedictine monastery called Podlajice in Bohemia. We can date it reasonably well from clues inside the book itself, and the detective work is rather satisfying. There's a Bohemian saint mentioned in its calendar who wasn't officially made a saint until the year 1204, so the book can't be older than that. You don't list someone as a saint before the church says he is one. And a Bohemian king who died in 1230 is conspicuously missing from a list of the dead where you'd absolutely expect to find him recorded, which strongly suggests the relevant pages were written while he was still alive before 1230. So the window is fairly tight, somewhere in the first 3 decades of the 1200s, and it's worked out not from any legend or any signature, but from the dry internal evidence of who's in the calendar and who isn't. The book dates itself, if you know how to read it. The contents are genuinely astonishing for a single volume and worth running through, because the famous devil portrait makes people forget that this is, at heart, a working reference library. The complete Latin Bible, The whole thing, Old Testament and New. Though oddly, a couple of books in it come from an older translation than the rest, which is its own small puzzle. The two great histories of the Jewish writer Josephus on the ancient Jews and the war with Rome. The vast encyclopedia of Isidore of Seville, which was the medieval world's single best attempt to cram the sum of all knowledge into one reference work. Grammar, medicine, law, the natural world, everything. A chronicle of Bohemia, the local history of the land it was made in, medical texts, including material descending from the old Greek physicians, a calendar and a register listing the death dates of monks and notable people, a memorial of the community's own dead, and, this is the part that always gets overshadowed by the devil sitting a few pages over, a collection of magical formulas, spells, and exorcism texts. Charms to cure disease, a charm to catch a thief. Incantations, some of them drawn from Jewish sources, written down in the same enormous book, between the same wooden covers, as the literal Word of God. It really is a one-book library, including the shelf you'd normally keep behind a locked grille and not show to visitors. The sacred and the forbidden bound together, sharing a spine. And there's a small absence inside it that nobody can fully explain, which I rather like. The book originally had more pages than it does now. A handful of leaves were cut out at some point by an unknown hand for unknown reasons, and they've never turned up. The leading guess is that they held a copy of the Rule of Saint Benedict, the monastic code, which might have been removed when the book passed out of Benedictine hands to an order that followed a different rule. The more lurid guess is that they contained something somebody decided was better not to leave in a book that already had the devil's portrait in it. We don't know. Somebody, centuries ago, took a knife to the largest book in the medieval world and quietly removed a piece of it, and then said nothing. And now there's just a gap in the gathering and a question that doesn't close. Now here's the thing that genuinely unsettles the scholars who handle it, more than the devil does. And these are not people who scare easily, they study old parchment for a living. It's the handwriting. The entire book, all 310 surviving leaves of it, every line of that complete Bible and Josephus and Isidore and the spells and the chronicle, was written out by a single scribe, one person. And the script does not change. It is uniform from the very first page to the very last. There's no shift in style, no shaky patch where you can see the writer was ill or exhausted, no place where the hand visibly grows older or stiffer over the years it must have taken. One man, one consistent ink, made from crushed insect galls. One steady hand, all the way through a book the size of a small door. To the people who study medieval manuscripts, that level of consistency across that much material is almost eerie, and it's plainly where the one-night legend came from in the first place. The work looks like it was done in a single sitting by a single hand that simply never wavered, because in a sense, across all those years, it never did. It was not, of course, done in a single night. Modern estimates say that just copying out the text, the calligraphy alone, with none of the decoration, none of the illustrations, would have taken something like 5 years of continuous full-time writing. And nobody copies all day, every day. Add in the ruled guidelines that had to be drawn on every page, the big decorated initial letters, the illustrations, and the plain reality that a monk had prayers to attend and duties to perform, and a life to live around the writing. And the realistic estimate stretches out to somewhere between 20 and 30 years of labor. The library that holds it today reckons it probably took at least 20 years and could well have taken 30. So picture, if you like, a man who started this book as a young monk and laid down his pen on the final page as a middle-aged one, and whose script looks exactly the same on that last page as it did on the first, because he had trained his hand so completely to hold one single form that 2 or 3 decades couldn't shift it. There's something about that I keep turning over in my mind. Not the devil, the discipline. A man giving the better part of his adult life to one object, in such steady, unbroken devotion that you genuinely cannot watch him age in the strokes of his own pen. And Hermann, the immured monk of the legend, he might actually be real, which is a nice twist. The book's own register of the dead includes a man named Hermann, given the title The Recluse, meaning someone who lived shut away in religious isolation, an anchorite. That title, The Recluse, the shut-in, is almost certainly the seed the walled-up monk legend grew out of. But whether that particular Hermann was actually the scribe, nobody can prove. The library simply lists the maker as unknown, and there's a deeper puzzle underneath even that. Podlajica was a small, poor monastery, poor enough that a lot of serious scholars doubt it could have afforded the staggering quantity of materials and the decades of skilled labor to produce something on this scale entirely on its own. 160 animal hides is not a small expense for a struggling little religious house. So where the book was truly made, and by whom, and how a poor monastery in the Bohemian forest came to be holding the largest book in the medieval world, is honestly not settled. The legend gives you a clean answer. The devil did it. The history gives you a much more interesting unanswered question. What we can trace clearly is everything that happened to it afterward, and it reads almost like the book was determined to make a name for itself. Within about a century, the monastery had pawned it, handed it over to another abbey as security for a debt. It then moved around Bohemia for a few hundred years, from one religious house to another. And then in the 1590s it was carried to Prague to join the collection of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, a man famous across Europe for his obsession with the occult, with alchemists and astrologers and mystics and strange, beautiful, secret objects. Honestly, Rudolf is about the most fitting owner this particular book could possibly have found. A volume with a king-sized portrait of Satan in it, ending up in the cabinet of the most occult-obsessed emperor in Europe. It's almost too neat. Rudolf, by most accounts, more or less strong-armed the monastery into handing the book over. It had drifted back into monastic hands by then, and an emperor who wanted something for his cabinet of wonders was not a man you said no to easily. It joined his hoard of clocks and astrolabes and paintings and stuffed animals and alchemical apparatus in Prague Castle, one strange treasure among thousands. And there's a certain rightness to a book with the devil in it, ending up in the collection of a man who spent his life chasing the hidden machinery of the universe. It stayed in Prague, in Rudolf's collection, until the end of the 30 Years' War. That war again. It keeps turning up in these stories like a recurring character. the Swedes always somewhere in the frame. When Swedish troops sacked Prague in 1648, in the very last act of that long, grinding conflict, with peace already being negotiated elsewhere, they stormed the castle and carried the Devil's Bible off as war loot, hauling that £165 book all the way north to Stockholm, where it has remained ever since. The Swedish queen, Christina, was especially keen to get her hands on the captured imperial treasures. She was a serious collector of books and curiosities in her own right, and this was among the greatest prizes that came north out of Prague. A book made in a poor Bohemian monastery, finished by an unknown hand, ending its travels as a Queen's War trophy 400 years and a half-dozen owners later. And then, in 1697, the royal castle in Stockholm caught fire. A serious, catastrophic blaze that gutted the royal library where the book was kept. The Codex Gigas survived for one reason only. Somebody threw it out of a window, a book the weight of a grown man, hurled from the upper floor of a burning building to save it from the flames. And the story goes that it came down and landed on a poor bystander standing below and injured him. The binding got knocked about in the fall, but the book lived, which is a great deal more than you can say for most of what was in that library, much of which simply burned. It was eventually moved to its current home at the National Library, where physical access to the actual object is tightly restricted. You and I are not getting our hands on it, but the entire thing has been photographed in high resolution, page by page, so anyone with an internet connection can now turn to the devil whenever they like, which is a strange thing to be able to say. In 2007, it briefly went back to Prague for an exhibition, the first time the book had been home in over 350 years, and people lined up to see it. There are ghost stories attached to it too, naturally, because how could there not be? A Swedish text from the 19th century tells of a library guard who woke in the night to see the great book floating through the air, leading the other books in a kind of slow dance around the room, and who was driven permanently out of his mind by the sight. The playwright August Strindberg, who actually worked at that library and had his own serious dabblings in the occult, supposedly used to sneak in at night to read from the thing by the light of matches, hoping to make contact with something on the other side of it. Stories, all of them. But you can see exactly why a book like this gathers them. It's the right size and the right weight, and it has, quite literally, the right picture in it. A book that heavy, with the Prince of Darkness staring out of it dressed in a king's ermine, was always going to collect legends the way an old battlefield collects ghost stories. Not because the legends are true, but because the object practically demands them. Let's move now from a secret one monk might have carried in his own head for 30 years to a secret that an entire empire guarded for the better part of 400. And unlike the monks, this one genuinely got lost, completely, and we have never found it again. If you were defending the city of Constantinople in the 7th century, you had two things going for you. On the landward side, you had the strongest set of walls in the world, the great triple Theodosian walls that had turned back army after army, and on the other sides, you had the sea. The trouble was that your enemies were learning to come at you by sea, in great fleets, and walls don't stop ships. A wall is no use at all against a navy sailing into your harbour. And then, Somewhere around the year 672, the Byzantines deployed something that was extremely good against a navy. They called it sea fire, or liquid fire, or simply the manufactured fire. Their own names were plain and descriptive. We know it as Greek fire, and it may well be the single most effective secret weapon in the history of warfare. Partly because of the terrible thing it did, and partly because of how completely the knowledge of it eventually vanished from the earth. What it did was burn on water. That's the detail that froze the blood of everyone who ever faced it. Throw an ordinary fire into the sea and the sea puts it out. That's what water is for. Greek fire didn't go out. It clung to the hulls of ships and to sails and to men, and it kept burning on the surface of the water itself, spreading across the waves, and it was almost impossible to extinguish. The sources say it yielded to only a few things: sand to smother it, vinegar, and in one memorably grim recipe, stale urine. Everything else just fed it or spread it. The Byzantines pumped it out of bronze nozzles mounted on the prows of their warships, a pressurized stream of burning liquid that they could aim and direct onto an enemy fleet, sweeping it across the water like a hose of flame. The people who saw it used never forgot it as long as they lived. One crusader, watching the weapon deployed generations later, described it coming through the air with a tail of fire behind it, as long as a great spear, roaring as it came like thunder out of the sky, looking for all the world like a dragon flying straight at them. That's a hardened soldier reaching for the only image vast enough to hold what he'd just watched. A flying dragon. He had no other word for it. The traditional inventor was a man named Callinicos, described as an architect or craftsman from the region of Syria, specifically the city of Heliopolis, who fled into Byzantine territory after the Muslim conquest swept over his homeland, and who brought the secret of the fire with him as a refugee. The chronicler Theophanes, writing more than 100 years after the fact, says plainly that at that time Callinicos, an artificer from Heliopolis, fled to the Romans. That's the Byzantines, who never stopped calling themselves Romans, and that he had devised a sea fire which set the Arab ships alight and burned them with everyone aboard, and that this is how the Romans came home in victory and discovered the sea fire. That's about as clear an origin story as you get from a medieval source. Whether Callinicos truly invented the whole thing from nothing, though, is genuinely murky, and I won't pretend otherwise. The same chronicle seems to describe fire-throwing ships with nozzles already in use a year or two before Callinicos is supposed to have shown up, which has led some historians to think he improved or perfected an existing weapon rather than dreaming the entire concept up alone in his workshop. One major scholar of the subject argued that Greek fire was probably not the brainchild of any single person at all, but the work of chemists in Constantinople who'd inherited centuries of accumulated knowledge from the old chemical school of Alexandria. Incendiary weapons themselves weren't new. People had been throwing fire at each other in war for well over 1,000 years by that point, and there are old recipes for combustible mixtures going back to antiquity. What was new, what changed everything, was that this particular fire could not be drowned. You couldn't put it out with the one thing that had always put fire out, and it saved the city. Not once, repeatedly. The naval version, the one mounted on warships, was the heart of it. But the Byzantines worked out other uses too, once they had the substance in hand. They had handheld grenades, clay pots filled with the burning mixture, thrown by soldiers like a medieval firebomb. And eventually they developed a portable handheld projector, a smaller version of the ship's siphon that a man could carry and aim, which is about as close to a flamethrower as the early Middle Ages ever came. The big dramatic image is the warship sweeping fire across an enemy fleet, and that's the one the chroniclers loved. But the weapon had a whole family of forms. When the Arab fleets came against Constantinople in the 600s and 70s, in a long campaign that dragged on for years, with the Arabs sailing back each spring to try again, Greek fire helped break them, season after season, until they finally gave up and withdrew. And then, in 717 and 718 came the truly desperate one, the siege that everything hung on. A massive Arab army and an enormous fleet laid siege to the city by land and by sea at the same time, in a coordinated effort meant to finish Constantinople for good. The new Byzantine emperor, behind those great triple walls, turned his navy loose with the fire. The Arab ships burned on the water. When a fresh Egyptian fleet arrived later to reinforce the siege and slipped into position, the Christian crews who'd been pressed into Arab service deserted en masse to the Byzantine side, and the emperor caught the rest of that fleet and destroyed it with fire as well. Between the burning ships, a brutal winter that left snow on the ground for 100 days straight, famine in the Arab camp, disease running through the besiegers, and enemies harassing them from behind, the whole enormous campaign collapsed in on itself. The siege was lifted in the summer of 718, and the retreating Arab fleet was then largely finished off by storms on the way home. Historians generally regard that as one of the moments that kept the Arab conquests from rolling on into southeastern Europe, a liquid that burned on water, and the entire future shape of a continent bends quietly around it. The weapon kept earning its reputation long after those first great sieges. The Byzantines turned it on their own rebels during civil wars, and they used it to devastating effect against the raids of the Rus, the Scandinavian descended warriors who came down the rivers from the north in their longships to attack the city. One such fleet, in the 10th century, sailed in confident and numerous, and was met by Byzantine ships pumping fire across the water, and the Rus survivors went home with stories of a weapon that seemed to call down the very lightning of heaven onto the sea. Anyone who came at Constantinople by water eventually ran into the same horror, and the memory of it spread through every people who fought the empire. You did not want to face the Roman fire. Everyone knew that, even the people who couldn't make it. The Byzantines understood exactly what they were holding, and they guarded it like nothing else in the empire. The Emperor Constantine VII, who fancied himself a scholar and wrote a long manual of statecraft for his son and heir, put a stern warning about the fire right into it. Never give up the secret of it, he told his son, never under any pressure, because, and here's the part that tells you how the empire thought about this weapon, it was not a human invention at all. It had been revealed by an angel to the very first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great, and the angel had bound him with an oath to make it only for Christians, and only in the imperial city, and never anywhere else. To drive the warning all the way home, Constantine added a cautionary tale about a court official who had once been bribed into handing some of the fire over to the empire's enemies, and who was struck down by a flame from heaven as he was on the very point of walking into a church. Whether anyone at court actually believed the bit about the angel or not almost doesn't matter. The message underneath it was perfectly clear and perfectly chilling. This secret is sacred. It is ours alone. And betraying it doesn't just get you executed, it gets you struck dead by God Himself. And the secrecy worked, which is the remarkable part, and ultimately the tragic part. Knowledge of how to actually make Greek fire was kept inside a tiny circle, a handful of families and technicians and a few emperors, with horrific penalties hanging over anyone who talked, and it held. The result is one of the strangest facts in military history. Even when the empire's enemies physically captured the weapon, and they did more than once, the Arabs took a Byzantine fireship intact at one point, and the Bulgars captured the actual nozzles and stores of the substance itself in another campaign. They still could not reproduce it. They had the hardware sitting in their hands, the very apparatus, and they could not work out how to make it function. They gave up and went back to catapults and ordinary clay firepots. The recipe stayed locked inside Constantinople, behind the oath and the angel and the penalty of death, even when the machine that delivered it had been carried off as plunder. Which is exactly why we don't have it now. The secret was kept so tightly by so few people for so many generations that when the Byzantine Empire slid into its long, slow decline, when the knowledge was no longer being carefully handed down from one initiate to the next, when the few people who actually knew it began to die without ever writing it down anywhere it could be found, it simply went out, like a candle nobody noticed was the last one still lit in the house. There was no dramatic moment, no burning library where the one copy of the formula was lost. That's the eerie thing about it. A weapon this important didn't vanish in a catastrophe. It just quietly stopped being passed on, link by link, until the chain ran out and there was no one left who knew. By the time the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, turning on the very city they had supposedly come east to help, which is its own dark story, the weapon had already faded out of the records. Nobody ever published the formula, because publishing the formula was treason against both the emperor and against God, and so the formula died as quietly as it had been guarded, with the last small handful of people who carried it in their heads. The composition of Greek fire is, to this very day, genuinely unknown. Not scholars argue about the fine details unknown. Actually, completely, irretrievably lost. The most important defensive weapon of the medieval Mediterranean, the thing that twice saved the greatest Christian city on earth, and we cannot reproduce it because the people who could were simply too disciplined for too long about keeping their mouths shut. Their secrecy saved their empire, and then it outlived their empire and took the secret down with it. That hasn't stopped anyone from trying to reconstruct it, of course. And the theories are where the subject gets really interesting. Almost everyone now agrees the base of it had to be petroleum, crude oil, naphtha, and the Byzantines had access to it from natural seeps around the Black Sea and the Caucasus, places where the stuff literally bubbles up out of the ground on its own. They didn't need to drill for it. They could collect it where it pooled. To that oil they very probably added pine resin to thicken it and make it sticky and slow burning, so it would cling to whatever it landed on rather than just running off and going out. And that detail is actually supported by old descriptions of the weapon being sticky. Beyond those two ingredients, the oil and the resin, it's all educated argument. Sulfur, possibly, to help it catch and to thicken the smoke. Quicklime, calcium oxide, which reacts violently with water and gives off a great deal of heat, and which would explain the burning on water effect, except that quicklime alone doesn't actually ignite when it's dry, so it can't be the whole answer on its own. Saltpeter, maybe. Various other compounds that do alarming things on contact with water. The end product was something not a million miles from a medieval version of napalm. A burning, sticky, water-resistant liquid, sprayed out under pressure across the surface of the sea. And the pressure part may be half the actual secret, which is something I find genuinely clever about the whole problem. One historian who's done serious work on this, John Haldon, points out a very real engineering difficulty. Crude oil collected straight from a seep turns into thick tar or pitch within about a day. It doesn't stay a thin, sprayable liquid for long, so the Byzantines must have had some method of treating it, or distilling it, or storing it in a particular way that kept it liquid and projectable for as long as they needed it. And that process, the chemistry of keeping the fuel usable, of preventing it from thickening into uselessness before a battle, might have been guarded just as jealously as the recipe for the burning itself, and might be just as completely lost. Two secrets, really, folded into one: what to mix, and how to keep it ready. Lose either half and the weapon stops working, and the empire took both halves to the grave. There's also the delivery apparatus to account for, which was a real piece of engineering in its own right. The descriptions point to a three-part system: a pump to pressurize the liquid, a brazier or preheater to warm it before it went out, because warm oil flows and sprays in a way cold oil won't, and a bronze nozzle on a swivel so the operator could aim the jet. Getting all three to work together on the deck of a moving wooden ship, in combat, without setting your own vessel alight is not a trivial thing. The Byzantines clearly trained crews to do it and did it reliably for centuries, which is itself a kind of lost knowledge. Not just the recipe, but the whole craft of using the stuff safely under fire. Haldon went so far as to actually build a working version of the whole delivery system for a television documentary based on the bronze pump and the preheater and the swivel-mounted nozzle that the old sources describe. And it worked. Crude oil mixed with wood resin, a flame coming out at well over 1,000 degrees, a jet of fire reaching out something like 15 meters across the ground. He proved that the machine itself was entirely possible to build with the materials and the metalworking the Byzantines actually had. The hardware checks out. But here's the detail from that experiment that, to me, tells you exactly how much is still missing. When Haldan's team pressurized and heated the oil tank, the thing turned out to be so dangerously prone to exploding that even modern welding couldn't reliably hold it together. They had to relocate the pump for the safety of the people running it. And yet the Byzantine sources record no such accidents, no fire ships blowing themselves apart, no exploding tanks taking out their own crews, no catastrophes on the deck. They used this weapon, by the deckload, on wooden ships, in the heat of naval battle for centuries, apparently without their own equipment routinely killing them. So either the Byzantines knew a refinement that modern reconstruction still hasn't recovered, some trick of the mixture or the apparatus that made it stable and safe enough for daily use, or there's some absolutely crucial piece of the method that we simply do not have and may never get back. The mechanism we can rebuild from the descriptions, the exact recipe, and whatever it was that made it safe enough to handle on the rolling deck of a warship day after day after day, went down into the dark with the empire that invented it, and it has never once come back up. Let's end the night with something different again. Not a lost recipe, but a lost kingdom. A kingdom that never existed at all. And yet kings and popes and explorers spent something like 500 years looking for it across 2 continents. For roughly 5 centuries, educated Europeans believed, sincerely and stubbornly, that there was a Christian emperor of unimaginable wealth and power ruling somewhere far to the east, beyond the lands of Islam, and that if they could only reach him, he would become their great ally against their enemies. His name was Prester John. Prester is just an old, worn-down form of presbyter, a word for a priest or an elder. So, a priest-king. A man who was somehow both pope and emperor at once, sitting on a throne somewhere out past the edge of the known world, commanding more gold than all of Christendom put together, and just waiting to join the cause. And people did not treat this as a pleasant fairy tale to tell children. They treated it as foreign policy. They organized expeditions around it. Popes wrote him letters and sent them off by messenger. Explorers set sail looking for him, and he was never real, not for one single day in the whole 500 years. There was never a Prester John. The story starts to take shape in the 1140s, though there were faint, garbled hints even earlier, reports drifting into Rome and Constantinople in the 1120s about a Christian patriarch or archbishop visiting from India, full of tales of a far-off Christian land, probably distorted echoes of the genuine St. Thomas Christians, who really did live in India, and traced their faith back to the Apostle Thomas. Those early reports were vague and went nowhere on their own. The first solid appearance comes with a German bishop named Otto of Freising, a serious historian for his time, who recorded that he'd met another bishop at the papal court who told him an extraordinary tale. There was, this bishop said, far to the east beyond Persia and Armenia, a king who was also a priest, a man named John, and he was a Christian, a Nestorian Christian from one of the Eastern churches. And he was descended from the Magi, the wise men who'd followed the star to the infant Christ. This John had supposedly gone to war against the kings of the Persians and crushed them utterly, stormed their capital, and had fully intended to march all the way to Jerusalem to come to the aid of the Christians fighting there, but had been stopped in the end because he couldn't get his great army across a river. To Europeans who had just suffered serious losses in the Holy Land, this news was electric. A powerful Christian king out in the east, already winning, already beating the Muslims in open battle, who had very nearly come to help them and might yet come the next time. The bishop telling the story may well have had a quieter political motive, a reminder to a complacent Europe that even this mighty Eastern ally couldn't be relied on, so they'd better look to their own defences. But the part everyone heard and held on to was the glorious part. There's a Christian king in the East, and he's enormous, and he's on our side. And there's a real event buried underneath that story, which is what makes the whole legend so genuinely fascinating, instead of just being a piece of medieval gullibility. A few years before Otto wrote any of this down, in 1141, there really had been an enormous battle out on the steppes of Central Asia, near Samarkand. A people called the Kara Kitai, who had fled the collapse of a dynasty in northern China and travelled west to carve out a brand new empire in the heart of Asia, met and smashed a major Muslim Seljuk army in a single catastrophic day on the open grassland. The Muslim Sultan barely escaped with his life. His wife was captured. The dead were counted in the tens of thousands, by some estimates far more. And the Kara Kitai realm genuinely did contain Christian communities. Followers of the Church of the East, the so-called Nestorians, who had spread their faith improbably far across Asia, into lands no European had ever seen. So here is the raw material, a great Eastern ruler crushing a Muslim power in battle in a land that had real Christians living in it. By the time news of that victory had travelled all the way west, passing through several languages and an enormous amount of wishful Christian thinking along the way, it had quietly transformed into a Christian priest-king defeating the Persians and nearly marching on to save Jerusalem. The Kara Kitai rulers were, in plain fact, Buddhists. It made no difference whatsoever to the story. The legend had been handed everything it needed, and it ran. Then, around the year 1165, the whole thing exploded across Europe because a letter began to circulate. The letter of Prester John. It was addressed, in its main version, to the Byzantine Emperor, and in other copies to other great rulers of Europe. It is a forgery, a complete fabrication, and to this day nobody knows who actually wrote it or precisely why. But it became one of the great bestsellers of the entire Middle Ages, copied and recopied by hand and translated into language after language across the whole continent. Hundreds of manuscript copies of it survive even now, which for a handwritten document in an age before printing is a genuinely staggering number. It means people wanted it badly enough to spend the enormous labor of copying it out over and over. And the reason it spread like that is simple. It is an absolutely intoxicating piece of writing. In it, Prester John describes his own kingdom in his own voice. And the kingdom he describes is a wonderland of the kind that makes you understand instantly why people refuse to let the dream die. He rules the 3 Indies, he says. 72 lesser kings pay him tribute. His land flows with milk and honey. At the foot of a certain mountain there's a spring that changes its flavor every single hour of the day. And anyone who drinks from it 3 times after fasting will never be sick again for the rest of their life, and will stay forever young, a fountain of youth written right there into the letter as a matter of fact. There's a sea made not of water, but of sand, with strange fish swimming through it that you can catch and eat. There's a river that rolls with stones instead of water tumbling along, and not far from it a stream whose gravel and sand are made entirely of precious gems, free for the gathering. Children in his land can live underwater for months at a time, diving down to collect the jewels. There's a herb that drives out evil spirits and actually forces demons to announce their own names. There are salamanders that live inside fire and produce a kind of silk that you wash not in water, but in flame. There are ants the size of dogs that dig gold up out of the ground. His palace is roofed in gold and set with gems that glow in the dark, so that it is never truly night inside. And there's an enchanted mirror mounted on a high tower from which he can watch over every corner of his entire empire at once, seeing any plot before it can form. And in one detail I have always loved for its sheer, baffling specificity. Among all the gold and the salamanders and the fountain of youth, the letter brags that in his whole vast kingdom not a single frog ever croaks. Of all the marvels in the world to claim, no noisy frogs. Whoever forged this thing had a strange and wonderful mind. It was simply too much to resist, and Christendom did not resist it. The timing mattered enormously too. This was the age of the Crusades, when European Christians were pouring east to fight for the Holy Land and getting beaten back as often as not, watching cities fall and armies break. The promise of a vast Christian empire somewhere behind the Muslim world, an ally who could attack from the far side and catch the enemy between two fires, was exactly the hope a struggling crusader most wanted to believe. The legend didn't survive 5 centuries by accident. It survived because it answered a need. It told frightened, outnumbered people that they were not alone, that help was out there in the East, enormous and Christian and waiting, if only someone could reach it. The Pope himself, Alexander III, took the letter seriously enough that in 1177 he wrote a formal reply to Prester John, and sent it off to the East in the hands of his own personal physician, a man named Philip. And Philip rode away, carrying a papal letter addressed to a king who did not exist, bound for a kingdom that was not there, and he was never heard from again. The records simply stop. He presumably never found the place, because the place wasn't anywhere to be found, and whatever became of him on the long road east is just one more thing the legend quietly swallowed and never gave back. A real man, with a name, who vanished into a search for an imaginary king. The hope was strong enough that it actually launched real journeys into the unknown. When the Mongols loomed and Europe couldn't tell whether they were the dreamed-of allies or a new nightmare, the Pope sent friars east to find out. Franciscan monks who travelled thousands of miles across Asia to the Mongol courts, partly carrying the hope of finding Christian friends out there, Prester John or his heirs. They went, these men, on foot and on horseback, across deserts and steppes that no Western European had any map for, chasing a rumour. They came back with the first real European descriptions of Central Asia and the Mongol Empire, genuine, valuable knowledge, gathered in the course of looking for a king who was never there. The search for Prester John, false as its object was, kept dragging real Europeans out past the edges of their own maps, and they kept bringing back the real world in their saddlebags. And here's what I find genuinely remarkable about the whole affair: the way the kingdom kept moving on the map as Europe slowly learned more about the world, always staying just past the edge of whatever was actually known. As soon as travelers reached one supposed location and found no priest-king there, the kingdom simply relocated further out into the next blank space on the map. At first, the realm was placed in India or somewhere in Central Asia, safely beyond anyone's ability to check. Then, when the Mongols came storming out of the east in the early 1200s, Europeans got briefly, wildly excited that this had to be Prester John at last, or his descendant come to help. There were reports of a great King David, said to be Prester John's grandson, marching westward to crush the Muslims between two fronts and reopen the road to Jerusalem. The army that was actually coming, of course, was the Mongol horde, and the Mongols had not the slightest interest in liberating Jerusalem for anyone. They were interested in conquering everyone in their path, Christian and Muslim alike, and Europe would shortly be terrified of them. But the legend, undeterred even by that, attached itself to a real figure. A Christian Khan of a Mongol-era tribe called the Karait, a ruler who genuinely did bear a Christian name, whose people had genuinely converted to the Church of the East generations earlier and numbered their Christians in the thousands. There really were Christian Khans out on the steppe. The legend had, once again, found just enough truth to keep itself alive. Travelers who actually went east, including Marco Polo, came back with versions of the story in which Prester John is a real Eastern king who ends up defeated and killed by Genghis Khan, in some tellings after a quarrel that began when he refused to hand over his daughter in marriage to the rising conqueror. So the legend kept getting pinned onto real, living people, a Christian Khan here, a defeated king there, and the real, living people kept stubbornly failing to be the glittering, all-powerful priest-king the letter had promised. Reality kept offering Europe a smaller, truer figure, and Europe kept holding out for the gold. So the kingdom packed up and moved one more time, and this last move brought it closer to the truth than it had ever been. By the later Middle Ages, Prester John had become firmly identified with the Christian emperor of Ethiopia. And this is as near to real as the legend ever got, because Ethiopia was an actual ancient Christian kingdom, genuinely isolated, genuinely surrounded by Muslim and pagan lands, genuinely ruled by an emperor, exactly as the legend had always insisted its priest-king was. Ethiopian ambassadors did in fact turn up in Europe and describe their distant Christian realm to astonished courts. And the Portuguese, when they began their great push down and around the coast of Africa in the 14 and 1500s, were explicitly, in part, looking for Prester John. The very voyages that eventually opened the sea route around Africa to India were tangled up with the long search for this Christian ally. Portuguese map makers of the era drew Prester John enthroned as the Emperor of Ethiopia, a real place on a real map, finally standing in for the imaginary kingdom that had haunted Europe for centuries. But the Emperor of Ethiopia, real and Christian and genuinely besieged as he was simply not a fabulously rich priest-king who could shatter the entire Muslim world between two armies. He was the ruler of a hard-pressed Christian kingdom in the highlands of Africa, doing everything he could just to survive among powerful and hostile neighbors. And as Europeans finally made real, sustained face-to-face contact with Ethiopia, the gap between the legend and the actual man became impossible to ignore any longer. A scholar in the 17th century eventually demonstrated outright, in careful detail, that there was no real connection at all between the actual line of kings ruling Ethiopia and the legendary Prester John of the letter. And so the search, slowly and quietly, without any single dramatic moment, simply stopped. 500 years of letters and embassies and expeditions and dreams, and the priest-king turned out, in the end, to have been a story stitched together out of 3 separate real things. A steppe battle that genuinely happened, a Christian Khan who genuinely lived, and a Christian emperor in the African highlands who genuinely reigned. None of them was him. Every one of them in its turn fed the idea of him. And the strangest part to me is that the letter is still there. It's still sitting in libraries all over Europe. Hundreds of surviving copies of a piece of fan mail written to a king who never drew a single breath, by a forger whose name nobody will ever know, that sent a real papal physician riding off the edge of the map never to return, and helped point Portuguese ships around the whole bottom of Africa and onward toward India and the age of exploration. A fountain of youth and a sea of sand and a frog that never croaked, in a kingdom that was never anywhere, and people followed it for 500 years, across deserts and oceans, certain that just over the next horizon they would finally find the priest-king waiting for them with all his gold. All right, that's where I'll leave you tonight. 5 stories. 5 empty spaces where a clean answer ought to be, and not one of them willing to hand it over. If you stuck with me all the way to the end here, you're exactly my sort of person, and I'd really love to know which of these got the deepest under your skin. The king who died in the wood with no one willing to say how, the city that danced itself half to death, the book worn thin at the devil's own page, the fire that drowned an empire's enemies and then drowned its own secret, or the king who was never born at all. The comments are open, and I do read them. So mind your candle, watch your footing on the way out of the woods, and I'll see you on the next one.